All right, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gerry Killeen. He has been based at the Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania for over 14 years, during which time he established the Environmental Health and Ecological Sciences Department. And I don't know when I met him, but was very fortunate to be told immediately to log on and to listen to his lecture in England on residual transmission. He has, over the years, supported several national malaria control programs, established the locally managed Dar es Salaam City Council Urban Malaria Program, which is a model system for government scale-up of active malaria vector population abatement to all major urban centers in Tanzania. And he has advised many groups, some of which I've participated in. And thus it is my pleasure to invite him to come up here and to give us further thoughts on residual transmission and the impact and the challenge that it plays to malaria elimination. I have no idea how that thing works.
Great. Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you, Scott. I'm enormously...
Step back from it? Or
step back. Yeah, I can. I'm kind of loud anyway. Yes. Okay. So
I'm going to take it away from you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Gina. I'm enormously flattered to be here. I didn't know Alan as well as many people did in this room, but I was lucky enough to meet him not long before he passed away, and it was just one of those fantastic encounters where you just click with somebody, two people that connect. And it was a wonderful discussion. First of all, we discussed what I'm about to discuss with you today, and that went very quickly with lots of nodding of heads and rapid conclusions reached. Then we talked about the role of African scientists and African institutions in elimination of malaria and the need to do more. Again, that reached a rapid conclusion. And then we moved on to more important things. We talked about our families, specifically our daughters. And Alan spoke at length about his two daughters. It's two, isn't it? Two, yeah. That one had just graduated from, I think, a master's that she'd finished. His other daughter was to be married soon, and I was relieved when I heard that I think he made his daughter's wedding before he was taken away from us. I think in recognition and celebration of the kind of person that Alan was, I think I'm going to feature, this is my little, this enthusiastic little bundle of joy is my little girl, and she's going to feature in this, and I'm going to take a more personal approach to this than I normally would. I wasn't sure about that until yesterday when I heard, just as I got on the plane, that she got malaria again. She's fine, thanks be to God. But, you know, she's not alone here. She's got a whole bunch of little buddies here, and the buddies are going to feature here too also. So this is the first graph of residual malaria transmission, and so this is the first trial of indoor residual spraying in northern Tanzania and southern Kenya, and you can see the same picture that we see in so many graphs. Massive, rapid impact. The champagne goes onto the ice, everybody's ready for the party, and the party never happens. And the reason for that is this. The mosquitoes didn't read the textbook. Well, one did. This is Anopheles funestus, which is the most, probably the world's most efficient malaria vector. And you see, we run out of triangles here because that vector was eliminated from that part of Tanzania and didn't return until 6 years after the spraying stopped. What we see here is the Anopheles gambia complex dramatically reduced, but still there in respectable numbers, and probably what we would know as Anopheles arabiensis today. Now, Anopheles arabiensis is the Bruce Willis of mosquitoes. It's very hard to kill. It does everything that you would not want a mosquito to do. It feeds, it'll happily snack on you while you're outdoors. If it enters your house and you are under an insecticide-treated bed net, it's not a kamikaze pilot. It's not going to commit suicide on your bed net. It's going to fly out immediately. Oops. It's going to fly out immediately and look for somebody else or something else that is unprotected and persist that way. Now, the something else is also very important. Cows don't transmit malaria, but they do feed vector populations, and they keep vector populations in business. So, and you know, is not an isolated example. I think the real big hammer blow for the global malaria eradication program was the Garki project, which achieved massive levels of control, an awful lot to be celebrated, but fell a long way short of elimination, and basically the same story. And we've seen this story repeated again and again over the course of malaria history. And so residual transmission, it's not a new thing, it's not a new concept, but we've forgotten a lot of the lessons that we learned back in the global malaria eradication program. And, you know, the collapse, the Garki project really, and the collapse of GMEP just cast a pall over confidence in vector control generally. God bless the bed net, which gave us all something to celebrate again. But you know, we got a little bit carried away with some of the optimism. I was in the room when this happened, and I was a little bit taken aback. Unfortunately, some more important people stepped in. Eleanor entered the world and decided, she refused to sleep anywhere else. And so, which meant I didn't get to sleep for about 3 months, which gave me time to work on this. And this is a very simple piece of theory that we put together to illustrate the point that bed nets, the primary mode of action of bed nets is not personal protection. It's about killing off vector populations. And therefore, it's all about getting decent coverage of the population in general rather than vulnerable groups. And the one thing, you might notice that under no credible conditions did we ever predict elimination. That's residual transmission that you see there at the right-hand side of that. And so since then, we've seen the actual scale-up, non-simulated scale-up of vector control, particularly long-lasting insecticidal nets. Now, we're not at zero, and you'll notice the scale on this graph isn't zero. So we're quite a long way short of zero. There are 4 million people walking around on this planet today who are alive because of the scale-up of long-lasting insecticidal nets. So there's a fine balance that's got to be struck between celebrating all that and being realistic about what's ahead of us. Now, as a family, we've been extremely lucky. We just happen to live in the part of Africa that has benefited most from the scale-up of vector control. We live in the Rift Valley corridor of Tanzania, where Anopheles gambia as a species has been basically eliminated. And we haven't, until very recently, we hadn't seen a specimen in the Ifakara area for almost a decade. Okay? And this is what it looks like. This is an example from Senegal. Now, what you see is this picture of massive reductions. I mean, a lot to celebrate here. And this was vaunted as evidence that elimination was just around the corner. However, if you look closely at the y-axis, that's incidence per month. Okay? That's still a lot of transmission. That's an awful lot of transmission. And so the experience of my daughter and all her little buddies has been totally different from the same kids born 10 years earlier. This is the age she was when she first got malaria, and this is the case for most Tanzanian kids where we live, that she got malaria at the age of 4. This is her in preschool. And most of her little buddies, they get malaria once every few years now instead of guaranteed once or twice every year. And that was the case. That's how things were if we were in Ifakara 10 years previously. And so in 2016, finally we see a definition for residual malaria transmission in the WHO terminology. So why did it take so long? The reason it took so long is residual transmission is a very uncomfortable truth. And the reason it's uncomfortable is that the scale of the malaria transmission monster is absolutely overwhelming. And it's very scary to look in the eye. I think we're just getting around to it now. If we talk about entomological inoculation rates of 600, and this distorts our view of the world so that we say an entomological inoculation rate of 1 is low. I'm sorry, but it's not low, and you wouldn't want it in your house. So taking as an example, 600 inoculations per year, bed nets do achieve 99% control of that exposure level, but 1% of 600 is an inoculation rate of 6 per year. That's twice a month. That's enough to keep everybody infected, and therefore, even when bed nets are doing their job, it just pushes you along this curve to barely to the point where you start to see progress. If you're lucky and you start here, then you get pushed down the curve and malaria starts to behave like a normal disease. But it certainly isn't a normal disease in most of Africa. Now, what that means is that high-burden countries, most of their transmission or most of their burden today is residual. It's not going to go anywhere no matter how many bed nets or how much IRS we throw at it. And there's a big chunk of malaria burden is residual. It's not going to go away by itself, and there will never be enough bed nets and IRS to make it go away. So enough depressing stuff. Let's talk about solutions. So let's talk first about the most obvious form of residual transmission, which is outdoor transmission. Now, even if you've got a classically anthropophagic mosquito that feeds at night and indoors, there has always been outdoor transmission of malaria in those settings. But also in Africa, we do have mosquitoes that like to go out for a snack, at very social hours of the day, about 8, 9 p.m., like Anopheles arabiensis. And I'd just like to emphasize, this is the face of residual outdoor transmission. It's a lot of fun. It's the best part of the day. This is when most of us drink beer or have our meals or sit down and have a flap. And so, in social science, we often talk about behavior change interventions. Do we want to change all of this? Or is this a case where the technology we've got to wrap the technology around the behavior rather than vice versa? Okay, so talk about behavior change. So that's burning elephant poo, which tells you something about how people feel about mosquitoes. That's a mosquito coil. People can't afford them. They don't like them. They're bad for your health. That's equivalent to about 30 cigarettes. And the more contemporary formats, they're good for barbecues in America or Italy or Australia or middle-class families in Jakarta or whatever else. They are too expensive and don't last long enough to serve the needs of the average rural African farmer. And it's that simple. And these technologies, we recently did a photo voice survey in which we asked people what they associated with protection against mosquitoes. And you'll notice that the existing repellent products, they didn't even feature. And in fact, people rated garden application of pesticides as being more important to them. Fortunately, there is kind of hope. Sheila Ogoma reformulated an old off-the-shelf volatile pyrethroid called transfluthrin so that it could be evaporated from basically old rice sacks, a very absorbent material that is good at soaking this stuff up and releasing it slowly. And we actually got protection, like good, satisfactory protection for almost a year, some degree of efficacy for 2.5 years, and some protection for people at distances of up to 5 meters from the source gadget. Now, a lot of people equate residual transmission with outdoor transmission, and I think that's a mistake. A lot of residual transmission occurs indoors, and this may actually be more important than the outdoor component. And where does it come from? We've known about it for quite a while, and I love this old piece from the 70s that basically said we do have physiological resistance problems, but mosquito behavior is the primary cause of persisting residual transmission in the face of IRS in Colombia, in Latin America. And it comes from this issue. These are mosquitoes that come into the house and then they leave again very fast. And they don't settle on surfaces very long. It takes about 7 minutes for insecticide to pass up along the leg of a mosquito to the target organs, And so if a mosquito only settles on a surface for a couple of minutes, that's pretty bad news for IRS. And then we see similar things for Anopheles arabiensis, which you can see is always harder to kill than Gambi or Phonestis. And the reason for that, it doesn't feed or rest for very long at any particular place. Now, again, let's not get depressed. Okay? So the good news is if a mosquito is more cautious and searches twice as many houses to look for a safe form of blood as another mosquito, it means it's twice as vulnerable if you can actually get the formula right. So I'm going to give you some examples. This is an example of a biological insecticide that grows into a lethal dose, regardless of how little the mosquito is contaminated with in the first place. And all I can say to the mosquito is, resist this, my friend. And here's some other innovations. You know it's a great paper when you read it and you say, oh, I wish I'd thought of that. It's using electrostatic netting to basically to offload insecticide dust onto mosquitoes. And even pyrethroid, resistant mosquitoes can't cope with pyrethroid dust in large quantities. Again, I'd say resist that. And they applied it so you only need a little bit with these Eve tube modifications. And then our own work, we thought, let's punish the mosquitoes who enter houses. Let's just put up some netting panels and allow the mosquitoes into the house. And then once in the house, this is what the mosquito sees from the inside. So to get out, it's going to follow light. It's going to follow airflow. That's going to take it to the netting panels. These netting panels do allow the mosquito in. It's pretty bad news if you're a mosquito. It's at least as efficacious in terms of mortality as IRS, and it uses a tiny fraction of the insecticide, and then you can mobilize things like long-lasting binding agents in the same way that we have for long-lasting bed nets. Now, that's for us amateurs. And then there's some people who've managed to do it without any insecticide at all. Diabate and Roger Sanu, they installed traps that we've been using as research tools for years. And guess what? That is not a pile of grass. That is a 40-centimeter deep pile of dead mosquitoes, okay? So, a little bit of imagination go a long way. We have been breaking the rules of the Global Fund for years through funding for refugee situations and doing common sense things like just extending the physical protection that we use. We've been doing in refugee populations for years. I was delighted to see Kim highlighted the role of migrant populations and hard-to-reach populations. And so in our neighborhood, it's rice farmers, and Swaikeba got a little bit of money to start developing these portable shelters to replace the traditional mud hut. I don't know how anybody ever slept in one of those things with all the mosquitoes we have in our region. Let's talk about cows. Okay. And piggies. Contrary to popular belief, the vast majority of malaria vectors on the planet are primarily zoophagic. They only accidentally feed on a person when they get close enough to us to kind of not be able to ignore us. And there's a particular problem we have with mosquitoes that feed on humans often enough to be really good vectors, but feed on animals often enough to escape from the worst effects of bed nets. And basically, if you look at the map of residual transmission remaining on the planet, there's one of these species basically everywhere that malaria persists. And even with the old technology that was available a long time ago, topical insecticides, the very successful randomized control trial in The Lancet. It's good enough in The Lancet, it's good enough for me. This guy, he's a clinician, but he's almost mad enough to be an entomologist. And he gets some really ugly patients. That's a pig, and that's an implant of ivermectin. So Carlos, started working with animal targets for insecticides quite some time ago. And just want to get things in perspective. Veterinary products are cheaper to get registered. The safety issues are much lower. And if you kill a human being, you've got a serious problem. If you kill this guy, you have a barbecue. It's not the end of the world. Now, but mosquitoes don't just feed on blood, and why would we wait for them to bite to get to that stage before we try and kill them? So let's talk about sugar. And what I love about the sugar guys, I'm actually deliberately showing old slides because these guys were working on toxic sugar rates a long time ago with budgets that I could fit in my wallet, and they were treated as fringe lunatics at the time. And to see them now presenting serious products that are approaching the marketplace, I said, we've got a lot to learn from these guys. And they did a lot of basic biology working with boric acid and squashed up mangoes. Okay. Well, that's counting down. Whoops. Okay. With these small-scale village studies showing that basically you could suppress vector populations with this. Larval control, the technology hasn't changed dramatically over the years. It has improved a lot, and so a lot of the products that are available, developed for the American mosquito control market, they're fine. There's nothing wrong with the technology. We need to work on the implementation systems, including the institutionalization, the reporting lines, the governance structures, all that kind of stuff. And that's also going to apply to the people who are now working on community-based methods for spraying swarms of male mosquitoes while they're distracted, doing their things, waiting for the ladies to turn up. Okay? And what I love about this story is it's a nice illustration of how the experts actually don't know much, starting with myself. There's a bunch of our guys working for Emmanuel Kaindoa, who found a whole bunch of swarms. This is in the village of Mavimba, and this is a photograph I took in exactly the same village at about the same time that those swarms come out. After 12 years living in the Kilombero Valley, I swore blind that there was no such thing as swarming in our region. They were actually swarming right above my head, and I know very little. And what we call established knowledge, I'm sorry, but we have to challenge it. So what do we do now? Suddenly we've got tons of options. Where do we spend our money? What are we going to do about it? And this is the big challenge, I think. The first issue is there is not going to be one size fits all. Your vector control package is going to vary depending on what your mosquito behavior is. And we are going to see market fragmentation. We are going to see locally tailored solutions, and it's got to be rational. It's got to be based on measurements. Now, while this new ivermectin implant that Carlos has been working on, this is new, the data that says it's a good idea for a large chunk of Latin America is decades old. We've been collecting this kind of data for years and not using it. It's all in the manuals. It's time for medical entomology to go back to being a science. Up to this point, it has been a habit. And the sugar guys, it's the simplest example in the world. They used food dyes to show, hey, if you can dye a mosquito, you can probably kill it. The products need to be responsive to what communities want. What are the barriers? What are the enablers? And IVCC have kind of really led the way in asking the awkward questions about, well, that's very nice, but our market is too small. The disincentives to the large-scale manufacturers are too small. The amount of global subsidy we have is too small. We need to take the pressure off these issues and address the disincentives for the manufacturers. And it can't all be subsidy. Sometimes it's got to be just better ways to use the same active ingredients. Now, I'm not saying that our Eve baffles are the best way to do this. I just want to take the photograph to illustrate the fact that IRS needs too much active ingredient. IRS coverage has contracted over the years. We can tweak around with it, but ultimately, it needs too much insecticide. Bed nets protect too small an area. The last time I got malaria, it was sharing one of these things with the entire family. And this is so well understood as a cause of malaria in Tanzania that there's a Swahili word for it, ulalavi. It's sleeping with your backside up against the bed net. It's too small a space. So, and if you look at the other thing I want to show you this is the amount of netting. There's actually, you can protect the windows and the eaves with the same amount of netting that it takes to make one bed net. So why is it we're prepared to subsidize netting for sleeping spaces, but not entire living spaces? We need to ask the awkward questions. And are these really is this really such innovative, wild thinking? I don't think so. I'm way over, aren't I? Okay, so let's get going. We need to listen to people, what they're saying. 3 out of these 6 photographs, highlight photographs, are of window screen. And then now that we've got something to get excited about for protecting the outdoor environment, are we going to wait till resistance takes this away from us and then finally say, okay, let's make some vapor phase actives and then put them through the insecticide treadmill and we're all back to square one in 20 years? No. As Nick said today, it takes a long time to develop anything. So we need to have the conversation today, and we need to make the investments tomorrow, not the day after. Now, these guys are qualified. This is the face of residual transmission, but it's also the face of the solutions. These enthusiastic little people, these guys are qualified because they grew up in Africa. These guys advise me all the time about life in rural Africa. And when they grow up, if we provide the opportunities, they're going to look like this. And I really advise anybody to go to these young scientist competitions in Africa and see all the talents out there that we are not using at present. And if they really grow up, then they're going to look like this. And these aren't just African scientists, these are African innovators. There's a difference. We've got a long way to catch up in Africa on industrial capacity and the large-scale manufacturers, but how to use those active ingredients. We're qualified to not just participate in the developing those application methods, but also there are people here who can lead it. And the transfluthrin emanator was invented by Sheila Agoma, and I could never have thought about it because I didn't grow up in rural Africa. Now, thanks to the Gates Foundation, thanks to Gina, thanks to Scott, thanks to the Ifakara Health Institute, where I've learned far more than I've ever taught anybody, and thanks to the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. There aren't many institutes who would let me spend all the time that I have spent in Tanzania. Thank you very much.